Welcome everybody to the 2023 Frontend Development Crash Course. We're going to utilize HTML and CSS to create this layout in the browser. You're going to learn the very basics in a crash course format so that you can decide for yourself if front-end development is for you. Now, in my previous crash course video, I showed you how to design this very layout as a UI UX designer. So if you want to start from absolute scratch, watch that video first. And finally, should you really want to learn more about building awesome layouts and want a more interactive approach from the ground up, definitely check out my interactive CSS course at DesignCourse.com. All right, let's get started. All right, so you can skip ahead in the timestamps if you are already familiar with the very basics of HTML and CSS. I wanted to do this for those of you who are brand new before we start jumping into code, and this will go by pretty quickly. So first of all, what is HTML? Well, it's called Hypertext Markup Language. Now, I'm warning you, if you're like an intern or something and you show up and you say, hey guys, let's write some hypertext markup language, you are going to get made fun of. Don't ever do this. It's HTML, okay? Now, next up, let's take a look at basic HTML anatomy based on a single line of HTML. All right, so let's break it down. First, we have the opening tag, which is that less than sign right over here. Then we have the actual HTML element, and sometimes this is also called a tag. This is the div element. There are many other HTML elements, a few of them of which are listed over here. All right, we can also see there's a closing element over here, and we'll talk about that in a second, with the same name. Now, we also have, next up is the HTML attributes. Class is one of many. Again, here are other attributes that you have that you can add to your HTML element or your HTML tag. And then finally, we also have the concept of self-closing elements. And for instance, this right here is not a self-closing element. It has an opening tag and a closing tag. And of course, with these types of elements, you can nest them inside each other, and you can have nest upon nest upon nest, etc., etc. This here is a self-closing element. All right, so image source, whatever, we don't see a closing tag. And there are a variety of different HTML elements that are self-closing and otherwise. All right, so you may be asking yourself, what is the purpose of HTML then? Well, looking at the design that we're going to build here in a second, to provide you with a visualization of kind of what HTML is doing, this is what HTML is basically doing, at least in the respect of helping you structure a layout. All of these red rectangles have to be accounted for in HTML code in some way, shape, or form. And we're going to talk about this ad nauseum throughout writing the HTML for this particular layout. So this is what we get in the browser. This is what everybody sees, but in order to kind of provide a literal visualization of the responsibility of HTML, this is kind of what's happening here. And you can think of it in an analogy such as HTML is your skeleton, and then CSS is the aesthetics, it's your skin, it's what everybody sees, all right? So now with that said, let's talk about actual CSS. Okay, so that stands for Cascading Style Sheets. Once again, if you walk into work for the first time and you tell people, let's write some cascading style sheets, they're gonna make fun of you. All right, so let's take a look at CSS Anatomy. And what we have here is a rule set. Typical projects have multiple rule sets. They have many, up to hundreds or even thousands of rule sets. This is one rule set right here, this whole thing right there. All right, so first off, we have what's called the selector. All right, and this allows you to basically say to CSS, what HTML element or elements do we want to style? Simple enough. Next up, we have the declaration. And that's defined by all the stuff that happens within these scrolly braces right here. Then we have properties. As you can see in this context, this particular rule set has a declaration of two properties. By the way, people don't really talk like that. We don't talk about declarations and stuff like that. This is just, terminology that most people don't use. But we do have properties here. There's two properties, background and font size. And trust me, there's a ton of properties that you can use in CSS. Next up are the values. So we have the property name with a colon with the value, and then we end that property or that particular declaration with a semicolon. All right. And then finally, we also have units. Sometimes some properties will have units fixed to them. And of course, there's, probably a dozen or so different CSS units that are categorized into absolute and relative positioning. And we'll talk about that as well. All right, so that is it. I told you it wasn't going to be that long for just outlining general concepts. Now, because this is a crash course, we are going to jump right in. All right, so I want you to go here to code.visualstudiocode.com, all right? And this is the web page from which you can download a code editor in order to write the HTML and CSS to complete this project today. This is a free code editor from Microsoft, and it's also the most popular and has been for several years now at least. And so depending on your OS, you're going to download the software package, install it, and then run it. And then once you run it, you'll see something like this. Now your color scheme might be different, no big deal. But over here, we can see that we have this thing called Foxica, which is the name of the fictional service that we're designing a landing page for. So that is basically an empty folder that I've already opened up. So if you go to File, Open Folder, right here I'm in Gary Simon code folder. So I've created a code folder where I store all my projects in, and you'll see Foxica right here. So you can right click, new folder. This situation might be different for Mac, but just you have to open up an empty folder essentially to get where I'm at right now. And so now we're going to go ahead and we're going to go right up here and we're going to click this button, which will create a new file. And then we have to give it a name, index.html. All right, so index.html, very typical starting point. Whenever you go to whatever.com, it's probably loading in the actual index.html. Of course, if they're using frameworks, it can be different. But for us, where we're not using any type of JavaScript framework or platform, we're just going to name this index.html, which is going to be the actual home page or the starting page when somebody goes to a fictional site like foxica.com or something like that. Hit enter. And you can see now that it's opened up here in this code editor where we can start writing our HTML. There's something called Emmet, E-M-M-E-T, Emmet abbreviations. Now, I've done a whole course on this. It's really simple. There's basically a few shortcuts that you can use that can speed up the process of writing HTML. And the very first one that I use every single time is exclamation point. Hit that, and now you can see it says Emmet abbreviation right here. And then hit enter. And it gives us a bunch of our starting HTML elements. So it gives us the very opening HTML and closing HTML tag. It gives us the head element with the various meta tags in here. This stuff right here, you really pretty much for the most part, you don't touch. You don't touch these, just ignore them. If it looks scary, don't worry about it. You don't have to touch them. The title is important because that's kind of the title of the page that shows up on the browser title, and also shows up like if people search for the company name or a keyword, and if you rank in Google, you'll see the little blue link or whatever. That's where it gets this from as well. So we'll just call this Foxica, just like that. All right, and we'll hit save. And of course, then we have our body element, and this is where all of our HTML is written, right smack here in the middle. So 99% of the time, you're writing within these body, the closing and the opening rather, and the closing body tag. So with that saved, we're going to also outside or just underneath the title tag here, we're going to type link. And again, this is an Emmet abbreviation. Enter. So that opens up the link element, rel style sheet, href attribute. And this href basically means give us a place to go. What we're doing now is we're going to reference a CSS style. All right, so we're just getting that out of the way initially because it's part of the HTML process. First, we're covering HTML, then the CSS. But I want to link that up. And typically I put it in a folder called CSS/main.css. All right, so we'll save that, Control S on your keyboard. And then we're going to go ahead and create that folder. So we're going to click this, which creates the folder CSS. And then we're going to click this, the file, main.css. And there you go. You can notice it opens up a new tab with main.css when we save that or hit enter. And we're ready to write our CSS in here, and it will get communicated automatically. Note, and this is something I never do, but you just understand that you could do that. If you didn't want to have to link another file to access your CSS, you could just put in style tags. So style, enter, that's an M abbreviation. And then we can start writing our CSS in here as well in this section. That's inline CSS. There's nothing wrong with doing it that way. But if it's a serious project, this index.html file will become real lengthy in the number of lines of code that has. And that's just annoying. I like to separate my files out. Same thing with JavaScript. We're not getting into JavaScript here in this crash course, but you can do CSS, HTML, and JavaScript all in the same file. But if it's a serious project, that's going to be a lot of lines of code. Might as well just separate them out with individual files. So I'm going to go ahead and back up, Control Z a few times, and we're ready to rock. All right, now before we start writing code, another thing to pay attention to, let me get this bigger, is a couple extensions. So Visual Studio Code, like Figma, if you watch the design version of this, this tutorial, you'll know has plugins or extensions. And that's right over here, right here in this section. And we're going to use just one. So if we click on extensions, you can go ahead, and by the way, if you like my color scheme that I'm using here, you can search for DesignCourse and install that. But the one that we want is Live Server right here. So just type Live Server in the search, and you'll see Live Server. You click on it, it's going to say install. Go ahead and install that. All right, so after you've done that, then you can come back over here for index.html, right click and open with Live Server. What that will do is open up your default browser. In my case, it is Google Chrome. Let me get out of here. There we go. And here's our blank index.html. It's going to show us exactly what we have so far in our HTML. So you don't have to do this, but if I just, do that real quick, hit save, Control S, you'll see right here, it automatically refreshes for us. And that way we can refer back and forth to the real, the real document in the browser as we're coding. Okay, so I'm just going to minimize that or move that off the screen. And now what I'm going to do is we're going to start writing our HTML, but that means we're going to have to refer back and forth to our design prototype or our mock-up that's in Figma to start to get an idea of where we're going to start writing and how we're going to start writing our HTML structure here. So I'm going to go back to this Figma document. This is going to be linked in the YouTube description. I advise you to definitely get a copy of this right here. There should be some simple instructions in the YouTube description on how to do that. And we're ready to rock now. Okay, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to create a duplicate of this. So I'm just going to take this. You can hit Control D or just hit Alt Shift and just left click and drag over. So now we have a duplicate, and we need to think about rectangles. Very strange that I say that, but yes, really when it comes to our HTML structure, just think of an analogy like this. HTML is the skeleton to the world of websites. All right, it's the skeleton, it's the scaffolding. All right, the meat and the visual, the skin, the aesthetics, that's the CSS, and we're going to get to that later in this video. But for now, for CSS to be able to do anything, it has to have HTML markup. It has to have the skeletons. So the skeleton in the HTML world is just a bunch of rectangles, if you think about it. So let me go ahead and get to the rectangle tool. I'm going to hit R. You don't have to do this, but I'm just doing this just to show you how to start thinking when you're structuring your HTML markup. So the very first thing that I start with, and most people do as well, is a wrapper element, okay? And essentially notice how this is emulating like a browser window right here, right? And if I take everything real quickly, group it and center it right here, and then I simulate like a large desktop monitor, well, it's always going to, I don't have it doing it correctly right now, but you want it to stay in the center at a certain point. There's equal white space on the very right and the very left as well. All right, so in order to achieve that, if you kind of think about it, everything is kind of wrapped, I'm gonna make this red, in a big rectangle, all right? And so that's what that wrapper element is. That's going to be our very first element, and everything is going to reside within that HTML element. And so you'll see this all comes full circle, by the way, when we get to the CSS and finish it up, and you'll see, oh, okay, so that's why we needed a wrapper element. So we're gonna wrap everything in a single element called wrapper, and it's going to be a div HTML element. A div element in HTML is really for structural purposes for the most part, like creating like this little overall rectangle that you see here. So let's go ahead back to our Visual Studio Code, and we're going to type in and I'm going to use an Emmet abbreviation for this. And so let me show you what I mean. I could type this out by hand, like div class equals wrapper, like that, and hit enter. Or I could be intelligent and type in period wrapper enter. All right, so a period basically means it's going to create a div element as class. Now, if you wanted to create an ID, like use the ID attribute instead, you would just do # wrapper, and that gives us an ID attribute. But I typically very rarely use ID attributes. We use classes, okay? So that's our first element. If we save it and go back, nothing, you don't see anything. There's nothing present here because a div element inherently has no style to it with like CSS. So if I go to F12 and we look right here, and this is the developer console, it kind of popped out here. And we look at the HTML markup, we'll see div class wrapper, but it's something that is not present at all. It kind of shows this thing over here. Div wrapper has no height, but it has 100% of the width because a div element will span by default 100% of whatever its parent container is. In this case, it's the body element, which goes all the way across. So it's 1182 pixels because that's the width of my browser right now, but 0 height. We don't see anything. Even if it did have height, we wouldn't see it anyways because it doesn't have a background color. It'd just be transparent. Okay, so next up, what is the next element we need to count for in our markup? So going back to Figma, next up inside of this overall container, this wrapper as we've called it, I'm going to duplicate this. The next element is going to be right here, if I can grab it. There we go. So it's going to be this element. And so we need an element that wraps around both the logo at the top here, all right, and also this navigation. And the reason we need an element that will wrap around both of those elements is so that if you notice right here, they are two elements they're in two columns. There's one logo to the left and then a navigation to the right. And so in order to instruct the browser to say, hey, we need two columns rather than the default mode where things will just sit on top of each other into two rows, we need a parent element around those two elements, and we instruct it with something like display flex, and that will put it into two columns. Hopefully that makes a little bit of sense at this point. All right, and so we have tags that will accommodate this common pattern for a website header / navbar. And so that element would be right here. We're going to just say header. Just type header, enter, and there we go. All right, so the header element in HTML, very important to use for good semantic HTML. So now we have to worry about what's inside the header? The logo. All right, so we're going to go ahead and we have to ask ourselves, is the logo clickable? Like if you click the logo with your mouse, like is it supposed to take you somewhere? Yes, it almost always should. People expect to be able to click the logo to be able to go back to the home page. So if it's clickable, it needs to be the HTML A element. So I'm going to type in another little bit of emit. Just hit A, enter. There we go. href, again, remember, just like up here, that means it needs to go somewhere. Now, of course, in the case of the CSS right here in the head, that means it's going to go somewhere locally to like a file that's hosted on the server. In this case, we don't want that per se. We want it to go actually nowhere. And that's because this isn't a real project. Typically, you could just put index.html if that's where your home page resides, or you could actually go like https:// like foxica.com. You could do that. But for us, we're just going to put the hash sign, which means you click it, nothing's going to happen. All right, so inside of here, we have what's called the anchor text. Now, notice this is not a self-closing HTML element. We have an opening, and then we have a closing tag here. That means we could put something in between it. You could just put some type like Foxica, but chances are, if you're dealing with a real project, it's going to be some type of graphic design element, such like a logo, such as an SVG element, which is the most common and most preferable element to use for a logo because it is vector. No matter how big it is, it will never get blurry and pixelated. So we do have that. And so right now, this is the point where you want to open up the resource files, the project files associated with this video tutorial. So just go ahead and open that zip file up. Make sure you extract those files. And we need to create a folder over here. The folder name is going to be images. Let me zoom up here. So we have an empty images folder now. Pro tip, right click on the folder and just choose Reveal in File Explorer. All right. And we can double click and you can see this is now empty. So wherever you save those project files, you can go ahead inside the images folder in the project files, just drag those over here. And I'm going to do that right now, actually. So I'm getting my reference code, and we just have 6 different elements we're going to use. So let me zoom up. We have 3 JPEG files, and then we have 3 SVG files that you can see right here as well. Logo.svg is one of them. Okay, so now we can go ahead and close that out. And so in this case, we're not going to use actual text as our anchor text for the A element. Instead, we're going to go ahead and use an image tag, an HTML image tag. So I'm going to type image, img, enter. Again, this is going to have a source. This is going to point to a file on our server, although it could be external server if another website's hosting, a logo or something like that. For us, it's going to be /images. So it's going into the images folder, and specifying logo.svg. We hit enter as we saw the little helper selector. Alt is a tag or an attribute rather, that is important for people with screen readers. So obviously they cannot see your logo, so they use screen readers. And this is also, by the way, good for SEO, search engine optimization. So for instance, in the case of screen readers, somebody is able to navigate through with the keyboard and just kind of listen to what's happening on a UI. And so the alt will instruct them, what is this element? All right, so the alt is like literally what it will play back to that person via a screen reader. So for us, we can say Foxica logo. There we go, and hit save. So you can see we have 2 HTML elements here. We have the closing element for the A element over here. Sometimes people will go like this, and that's fine. That's not going to affect anything. For me, when it comes to simple things like a link, I just keep it all on the same line. All right. There we go. So next up, what else is after our logo? Well, we have another element, and that is the actual website navigation. Let's refer back here to this element. All right, so let me duplicate this. So we have our A element, which is this little block over here. Let's duplicate that. Now we have another element that needs to wrap around these 4 links or these nav items. Again, it needs to wrap around because these are by default going to be stacked vertically on top of each other. We don't want that. We don't want rows for our desktop. We want columns. All right, and so for that to happen, we have to have a parent element that wraps around it so that we can instruct a browser to do that. So there's another semantic HTML element that we use for this purpose, and that is called nav. Very simple, nav. All right. So by the way, if I save this right now and we go to look at the result in the browser, we're not going to see much of anything just yet, just the logo over here. So now, when it comes to nav elements, we use another element inside of the nav element for basically structuring the type of data that's present. And the type of data that's present here is an unordered list, UL for short. That's the actual name of the HTML tag, UL enter. Then inside of there, we put our individual list items, or LI elements. So we hit LI, enter. All right, so now right now I could type, for instance, home. I'm gonna hit Shift Alt and down a few times, and we could change this to products. You don't have to follow along with this part. And if I hit save and I go back, we'll see we have a list, but they're not clickable. We don't want that, right? So we have to make them clickable. How do we do that? We use A elements, just like this in the logo. So inside of the LI element, we put A, enter. It's not going anywhere, so we're going to put in the little hash sign, and then we're going to put in home. So now if we save and go back, you'll see it is now a clickable link. Now we need to do that for the other ones as well. So I'm going to go ahead and right at the end of this line, Shift Alt down a few times just to replicate it. That way we don't have to sit there typing that out forever. Products, gallery, and finally contact. Now, this is what it should look like in your browser, something similar to this. Now notice there's nothing that's different about any of these four compared to each other except for the actual anchor text, home, products, gallery, contact. But if you notice in our Figma file, we do have this little underline right here. That's the active state. I've described this. Hopefully you will have watched the design portion of this about how to design, this whole website layout here. But this right here, we need a way for our CSS to add this underline based on the currently active page. In this case, we designed a home page, so that's why this little underline, is right there. So to do that, we simply attach a class onto the associated home element. So to do that, we're going to come back here, and we're right in the A element right here. We're going to say class equals active. All right. Now, if we save this, again, nothing's going to change because we have not yet got to the CSS portion. So you'll see how this comes around. I don't expect you to understand it yet if you're new to this. All right, and so that is the markup for our entire header portion, the top portion of the website. So now, remember, we want to stay inside of this wrapper. And you can notice, by the way, this div element, div wrapper, has a line that points all the way down to the closing div tag. That's handy, just so you know kind of where everything matches up. So we want to come just outside of the closing header element to start writing our next element. And let's focus on that. So our next element, and by the way, I'm going to get rid of some of these because it's starting to really get crazy. So our next element, let's just pretend this one's still here, this outer element, is going to be one that wraps around everything here. So we're going to have an element that basically houses two columns. All right, where are those two columns at? Well, there's one right here on the left, and there's also one right here on the right. So you have to think about how you're going to structure and group your elements in HTML. And it's one of those things, like once you're done watching this and you think you got it, and then you go to do it yourself, it will be confusing. It takes time, muscle memory. All right, that's why you should join the CSS course, because that's what it's all about. Anyhow, shameless plug. So we're going to create that. So first we have an outer element, and then we have a left column and then a right column. So let's create the markup for that. Now, there's another semantic HTML element that you use commonly for these types of things. You could use the section element, or you can use the main element. For me, this is the main section of the actual website. So I'm going to use main and hit enter. All right. So then we have a left column. So I'm just going to put period because it's going to be a class, left hyphen call. And then we'll do the same thing right here, right hyphen call for column. Again, you can just name it left and right. That's fine, but I'm choosing to add the dash call at the end. Okay, and you can name these classes whatever you want, essentially, for the most part. Okay, so now that we have that, let's focus on the left column, because based on how you read from left to right, it just makes sense to do that. So going back here, what do we have in this left column? Well, here is left call right here. The first element that shows up, top, bottom, left to right, it's this headline, quality apparel without the price tag. So headlines, every web page typically should have a heading or a headline is created with the H1 element. All right. They have H1 all through H2, H3, 4, 5, and 6. H1 should be the most important element as you go and you work through different titles or subtitles. Notice and also note that you can have multiple H1 tags if you deem necessary. So we're going to go ahead and specify quality apparel without the price tag. All right, so let's save that. Let's see what our design looks like so far. Yep, it's ugly because there's no CSS that we've specified yet. It's all going to look ridiculous like this so far. Kind of like the very, very early web in like the mid 90s. So after that, we're going to have our subheading. That's this text right here. Go ahead and copy that. Just double click into it and hit Control A, Control C to copy. That way we can save ourselves typing. So hit P, enter. This is a paragraph tag. You use this very often. By the way, Control B if you want to give yourself a little bit more space to collapse that sidebar. So Control B, it will toggle that on and off. So I'm going to paste that in. All right, so it's pretty long here. And if you want to kind of save yourself from having to horizontally scroll around, you could do something like this. Just hit enter, enter. There we go. So now if I zoom back up, just hitting enters here in your HTML isn't going to screw up anything. It's not going to like create a line right before the beginning of sake. So just understand that you can organize things decently if you wish. And notice it'll just keep on going on the same line even though we put a line break here kind of in the editor itself. All right, so next up after that is going to be this section. We have 2 buttons. Guess what? 2 columns. What does that mean? You remember, it means we have to put an HTML element around it. So just pretend all of our elements are still here. Again, just to quickly visualize, here's our H1, or rather, let me do this. This is the left column, this outer one right here. This is the H1. This right here is our paragraph element that we just created. And now we need one that wraps around these 2 elements to create those columns, 1 to 2. And then we have to duplicate that even further. And then we'll have an element for the button. And then also duplicate that, and an element for this secondary button right here, this spring. See, I'm telling you, it's all just rectangles. Okay, so let's delete some of these and let's create this markup there. Now, sometimes when it comes to your semantic HTML elements, you can get so specific like we are, like 2 call to actions. Like there's not a HTML element called call to action. And that's what we call these. Like it's the primary thing we want people to do is to click something or do something. There's no HTML element called CTA or call to action. So in that case, we can just use our own div class for that. So we're just going to specify right here a class called CTA-BTNS for buttons. All right, so we just did that overall red sort of, fake rectangle thing around those. Now inside of here, we have to specify that primary call to action button, the beige one that we saw first, and then the other one that says Spring 23 collection. So if we refer back to the design, we'll see this button consists of an element, this beige sort of a rounded corner thing, which we'll achieve in CSS, and then the type inside of it. All right, so here's how we do that. For this, we're going to use an A element, and we're going to give it a class called primary-CTA. So A period, and this is an M abbreviation, primary-CTA. So if we hit enter, it produces this HTML for us, which is exactly what we need. This is fake, so it's just going to go to #, and then inside of it, we're going to put in the actual button text, browse our collection. And that's it. That's only markup we need to achieve that beige rounded corner thing. That's the beauty of CSS. We can drastically change how ugly this looks right down here into what this looks like right here, okay? Now we have to do this one. Now this one's a little bit more tricky because notice it has an associated icon, this little right arrow. So if you think about it again, columns, what does that mean? We have to have an overall element that wraps around it in HTML that will provide the structure for this text and this icon to be next to each other in column format. So to do that, let's go back, and this will be still inside of our CTA BTNS class. We're going to specify one called, a link called secondary CTA. Hit enter again, oops, put a # and then come out here between these elements, hit enter again. And the reason this time I'm going to be putting the closing tag beneath it as opposed to on the same line is because we're going to have two elements inside of this A element. All right, because remember we have two elements, there's two columns, 1 and 2. All right, and so that's the text and the icon. So for the text, we need to wrap the actual anchor text in its own tag as well. It could be a div element or a generic span element. And that's what I typically use for this type of scenario. Span, enter, and then we're going to put in Spring, ;23 collection. So that's our first element. Now our next element needs to be that little arrow. So in that case, we have a couple options. We have to go back, we zoom up, control scroll wheel, if you will, and we need to make sure we're selecting this button or this arrow. To make sure you hit control left click to select it. And you'll know you've selected it if you come down here to your layers tab, and then this is highlighted right here, arrow 1. We right click it, and let me zoom up, and we choose copy and paste as SVG because this is a SVG element. It's scalable vector graphic. Anything created inside Figma, like with design illustrations, will typically be SVG. Not PNG, that's rastered in bitmap. You don't want that, and not CSS, SVG. Okay, well, once you have that copied, we're gonna go ahead and just paste it. So look at all this crap rather, that it spit out. It's long. In order to create that, look at all this HTML up there. This is basically a mathematical equation that gives us that arrow. And so because it's math though, that's why it's not bitmap. It'll never get blurry or pixelated like a blurry, ugly like 2009 iPhone photo or something like that. There's a couple attributes in the SVG element that I want to get rid of, and that is the width and height attribute. So I'm just going to left click, select both of those, hit delete, or backspace rather. We're going to leave view box, but we're going to get rid of our XML and S. Some of these are just unnecessary. We don't need them. Now let's save, Control S, and go back. And there's our huge arrow button. So we don't worry about it being this huge because we haven't got to the CSS. We're going to fix that all up when that point in time comes. Okay, going back here, that's it for our CTA section. So going back to the next element, we have this. And this one might trick you up at first because look at this. What is this confetti stuff? Well, that's because this is like we're proud to announce that we employ a workforce. Should probably fix that. There we go. Of over 50,000. It's all possible because of you. 50K. That's why I decided to put this little asset set of like confetti graphics over here. Ignore that for now. We'll get to that, but we're going to ignore that. Just pretend it doesn't exist. It's kind of on top of stuff. Don't worry about accounting for that. I'll show you how to do that in CSS. So really, I only want you to focus on, let's just get this out of the picture, this area right here. So we have a div element. We could see clearly because it has that black border, and it's wrapping around both of these columns, this 50K and this type right here. So let's create the element that will do that for us. Almost this element right here is actually visually depicted in our design, and it kind of mimics what's happening up here because we're giving that HTML element a border of 1 pixel solid in CSS. You'll see in a little bit. But it's still necessary. Even if we didn't want to visualize this and maybe we just hid this, it would still be necessary to have an element that wraps around it because we have 2 columns, like I've been trying to drive into your brain as much as possible. All right, so let's go ahead and do that. Let's go ahead, stop saying let's go ahead so much, Gary. And underneath, but inside, oh, no. Sorry, let's get out of here. So we have our CTA buttons section that ends right there after this closing div tag. We want to come right after that, right underneath it. But we still want to make sure that we're remaining inside of our left call. And this, if you follow it all the way down, will point to this right here. So we're still in it if we start typing our next code right here. This is underneath the, the CTA button section. So for that section, we're just going to call that news. And we're going to wrap that in a div class. So period, news, enter. And inside of it, we're going to have 2 columns, 50K and then a paragraph. So for that, we're just going to use paragraph classes for both of them. It doesn't necessarily even have to be a paragraph. Even though it says 50K, that's not a paragraph. You could still use the P element. So P dot employees. So it's going to be a paragraph HTML element with the P tag with the class attached to it called employees. Hit enter, and then just put in 50K. I'm going to capitalize that K. There we go. And then right here, P period details. So these are the details about, this little news thing. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy and paste what goes inside of here off screen. All right, so, what's going on? My editor's going crazy. Let's keep this tidied up because I don't want it to go off the screen too much. There we go. So now if I zoom up, try to get yours structured so that it looks like this. Don't worry that these are outlined right here. Where it says, we're proud to announce that we now have a workforce of over 50,000. Notice it has these strong tags around 50,000. That's because here in the design, it is bold. And strong will automatically bold the type that it's wrapped around, if that makes sense. And then it's all possible because of you, and that's that. So far, if we save this, this is what it should look like. 50K down here, huge arrow. It always does this with photographs and SVG elements. And yeah, all right. So now we're ready for our right column because if we refer back to our design, we'll see we've accounted for our HTML for our navbar or header, also all of our left column, and now it just needs HTML markup for these sections right here. All right, so going back to our design, let's remove some of these. And now, you guessed it, we're gonna need an element that wraps around this, which we already have. It's called right call, right? Right. So, we're going to need 3 elements inside of right call. We're going to give those a div class of card for each one. We're going to call these cards. So if I duplicate this, this right here is going to be card 1, And then imagine another one of these big, thick, red, ugly things wrapped around here for card 2 and then card 3 at the bottom. All right, so let's write that out. We're gonna first write out the markup for this one and then just copy and paste this one and this one. The markups are gonna look almost exactly the same, even though like this one's a lot bigger. We achieved that with CSS. All right, so inside of right call, we're gonna go ahead and specify a class called card. And again, we don't have to put like div.card because inherently Emmet knows if we don't put the actual HTML element in front of or before the period, it's going to be a div element. So we're going to say card, and we can chain multiple multiple classes together in Emmet like this. So we put a period after that, and this is going to be card 1. Hit enter. And this is what your markup should look like. So yes, you can have multiple classes inside of the class attribute. And the reason we're going to do this is because each of those 3 cards will share the same class of card, but we have to have a way to create the distinction between each of the 3 because they have different background images. Now there is a caveat to that using CSS pseudo selectors, nth of type. That's more intermediate stuff. We're not going to worry about that. We're just going to give them explicit class names that are different from each other. So inside of here, our card 1, we're going to have another element. Now first, I should say this right here, this div element in and of itself, that is what is going to contain the whole picture, the photograph rather. So we can use CSS to target that card 1 and give it a background image of this. So next thing that we have to write then, let me duplicate this, is these white little boxes. All right. And then you have to ask yourself, all right, do we see any columns here? I do. There is a column. Let's go refer back over here. Uh-oh, I hit Control D and something happened. Oh, it moved it down there for some reason. All right, so we have a column right here with this type and a column right here. So it's very important to remember this, the structure here. Okay, so what we're gonna do first in our card is we're going to wrap everything around that white container with a div element called card details. Okay. Now inside of card details, we need to have 2 elements because remember, it's 2 columns. We have the 2 pieces of type sitting on top of each other, but then off to the right is a price. So I'm just going to put in, and this is something you can completely do, just a div element with no class. You don't have to put classes or IDs or any attributes in them if you don't want to. So for me, I don't need to. In order to structure this stuff, we can just reference card details and then say div in CSS. So we could be like card details div. That's completely acceptable. There's only going to be 1 div element in there anyway. Okay, so now we're going to have a clickable link, and I'm targeting this Foxica Sports thing right here, this title. So we're going to assume that's clickable, so we put in an A element, # here, and we can give this a class of product title. Now, thinking about this though, if this is the only A element inside of card details, we don't even have to give it a class. I'm choosing to do it, but you don't have to. Okay, and one thing that does help though, in the case of like text, having a class name when it comes to readability for your CSS, if another developer's working on it, or even yourself in the future and you forget, you'll know that that particular rule set in CSS is associated with the product title because that's in the name. So hopefully that makes sense. Yes. Okay, so now let's go ahead and put in Foxica, let's see, sport. And then underneath it, we have a little paragraph, running shoes. It's kind of like that little tag or category or something like that. So P, and we're going to say running shoes. All right. After that, we have the price, which is off to the right in the second column. So we'll use a paragraph, a class of product -price, and we'll say 49, something like that. And that is it. So now what we do is we take left click and select that whole card, card one, all the way to the closing tag associated with that card, card one element. We copy it, come outside of it, paste it, hit enter, paste it. So now we have 3. So we'll see 1 says card 1. This one needs to change to card 2. This one needs to change to card 3. Hit save, and that is it. Now, of course, you can give it, fake other fake titles or whatever, but I'm just leaving them. So now, if we look, we can see this is what it looks like. Foxica Sport, running shoes. Here's our first one, second, and third. And guess what? That is about it for the HTML. So now I get our sidebar back up here. Let's close this out. We are now ready to proceed to the CSS section. Okay, so let's go to our CSS. So come over here, you can double click on this. It's gonna open up this blank CSS file right up here. So the very first element that I add, typically in every project, it's a rule set rather, we're gonna target the HTML element itself, which is like the element that holds everything. And I'm going to give it a font size of 62.5%. And what the heck does that even mean? All right, this is kind of, it's a little bit difficult to explain at first, but basically its purpose is to make conversions from your Figma prototype easier when you try to translate certain values to CSS. All right, so let's see if I can do this easily. And don't think it's too scary. It's one of those set it and forget it things. So if I hit save, we're gonna notice that, and in fact, let me just show you by dragging this off to the side so that we can see a little bit of this off to the side, this browser, even though it's hiding it. If I take this off and just delete that and hit save, the type just got way bigger. Now, I'm scaling the font size down, all the font size everywhere, because HTML, if you look over here, contains everything. So it's gonna take all the type that's found in here, and it's gonna scale it down to 62.5%. By default, it's 100. That's why it's bigger by default. But if I hit save, it just shrunk everything down. What is the purpose in doing that? Well, it's not because I want smaller type here. It's because it's going to make my conversion life, if that's a thing, it's not, I just made it a thing, a lot easier. So here's what I mean. If I go to Figma and I look at the font size, for instance, of this headline, and this is in the H1 element in our HTML. And the font size, if I select this, is right here, it's 52. All right. Well, I can't just put font size 52 pixels. When it comes to font sizing, along with certain things like your margins or your white space between elements, and you're trying to construct that in CSS, you pretty much never, for the most part, there's exceptions, want to use pixel values or px values. You want to translate those into units that are relative, as it's called. And in order to do that, you have to apply a conversion to it. And so what that conversion does, making all font sizes 62.5%, means that we only have to rely on decimal places, or decimal points. So instead of 52 pixels, we can put something like 5.2 rem units. So we just move the decimal place over one notch, and that will give us accurate sizes based on the design that a designer created or yourself in Figma, so that it has the same proportions. So it doesn't just apply to font sizes, it applies this to margin and padding, as it's called, and we'll use this often. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. It just makes conversions a lot easier. All right, so let's go back. And the thing that we're gonna start with now, after this very convoluted, like what the heck are you thinking situation, we're going to specify the body element. Now, if you remember, the body element is really the element that has pretty much all of our HTML markup inside. So here's the opening, the closing tags all the way down here, right there, the body element. So now, what does the body element do? What is it responsible for? Well, it's responsible for a lot, like our website background color. Ours is white, and that's what it is by default, so we don't even have to specify that, but there's still a few things that we want to do. First thing I'm going to do is change the margin to 0. All right, so by default, browsers will give our design a little bit of margin around. So what I mean by that is if I move this over and we take a look at the very edge, right there, we can see where it says Foxica. If I remove margin 0, hit save, see how it moved over? So there's a little bit of margin, and margin is a way for CSS in a browser to give you white space around things, like on the top and the left and the right and bottom and all that good stuff. But I typically want to remove that, so I have control over that myself. So margin 0. All right. Next up after that, we're going to have a font family. Now the font family, we have actually, in our design, we have 2 different fonts. We have this one, it's called Playfair Display. It's a nice, elegant sort of serif font, as it's called. And then we also have like this one underneath called Poppins, and this is a sans serif font. It doesn't have those little crazy things hanging off the top of them, like the letters and stuff. So this is a font pairing, and we need to be able to include both of those fonts. So first, let's specify the predominant font that's found throughout most of it is the cleaner font called Poppins. So I'm just going to do font family Poppins. Now when I save that, a lot of our type is going to change to that font. The logo's not, because that's an SVG and that's not a font really. It's an actual graphic asset. But everything else here has changed to that Poppins font. Now the reason it showed up on my computer is I have it installed on my computer. Many fonts that you use, other people may not have. So you have to include the font in your project in order for it, for other people who don't have it inherently installed on their phones or their computers, for then their browser to download it essentially. And so Playfair Display and Poppins are 2 fonts that are available from Google Fonts. So here's how that works. I'm going to create a new tab, fonts.google.com we're going to go to. And there's a bunch of cool fonts that you can use in your project. There's tons of them. So I'm going to do a search here, Poppins. You'll see it right there. You click it. And notice I have, because I've already set this up, I already have the fonts here. Notice how it says, if I zoom up, Poppins, I have Extra Light 200, 400, and 700. And I have Playfair Display regular 400, just one style. So you could see all the different font weights associated with Poppins. And so right here, it's going to say Extra Light 200. You want to click select, and then it's going to change that. And when you click select, it'll show up over here in this area. Hopefully that makes sense. You need to do that for 200, 400, and 700. And then after you did that for Poppins, you just go back, type in Playfair. You'll see Playfair Display right here. And just do regular 400. Right here, it's the top one. Once you have this situation to your upper right corner, you can then, let me zoom up, click this. Now notice it says to embed a font, copy the code into the head of your HTML. Or if you wanted to, you can actually import this as a style, or just take this whole right there, that's import text right there, and put it at the very top of your CSS file. It's advisable, however, not to do that. Just use this one right here. Hit this little thing, that'll copy it to your clipboard. And we go to our HTML. We put it above our main.css file and just paste all that stuff. There's a lot of stuff there. Don't worry about trying to make it readable or whatever. It's fine as is. So hit save, and there we go. So now other people who don't have that font will be able to use it or see the font that we intend them to see. All right, so after that, what is the next element? It is wrapper. Remember, wrapper wraps around everything. See, it's highlighted all the way down here. So let's create the markup for that. So I'm gonna put wrapper, not warper, wrapper. Come on, Gary, let's type. And the reason we need wrapper, and I tried to explain it before, is because to a certain point, let's close that out. Notice how everything is just like it's consuming the entire width of the browser. And I'm on a 4K resolution monitor right now, so it's real large. And I'm also zoomed up, so let me reset that. Okay, there we go. And so this huge arrow is letting us know that wrapper is doing nothing. What we want wrapper to do is what we intended to do in our design. We want white space over here to the right and the left here on desktop. So to do that, I'm going to come back here and we're going to say there's a property called max hyphen width, and that's going to be 1200 pixels. Now, where did I get 1200 pixels from? I just kind of pulled it out of thin air. No, it's actually pretty close. It's probably very roughly close to the value that's probably over here. So if I hit rectangle, I do this, it is 1164. So 1200 pixels is a pretty standard for me when it comes to the maximum width of my design on desktop, if that makes sense. Now, if I go back and I save this right now, notice how it doesn't extend all the way over, but notice how it's not centered, it's to the left. So to center something like this, and it's gonna be one of those things, there's a lot of properties to memorize, it's annoying, but you'll get it if you keep on doing this through muscle memory. We type in margin 0 auto. Now margin is a shorthand for margin left, blah, margin right, margin top, margin bottom, blah, 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 blah. And it's a shorthand property. And the way you can write margin is top and bottom is 0. So no margin or white space at the top or bottom, but setting right and left to auto will center it automatically. It will center this element. And that's what we want. So if we hit save, guess what? It's all centered. And that's what we want. Hopefully that makes sense. Don't get discouraged because this is a crash course and I'm just, it's a crash course. You probably feel like you've been hit by a car by now. That's why you need to take my course. I'm telling you, we start at the very basics. So anyhow, sorry, shameless plugs. What we're going to do now is, after that, is start focusing on our navigation section, which is the logo and this element right here. All right. So now we're getting to the fun stuff because we're going to start piecing together this layout. It's going to start looking exactly like our Figma design. Okay, so going back, let's look at the HTML markup for that section. We have a header element, and it has two elements inside of it. An A element, which is the logo, and then the nav element. Now remember I said ad nauseum, I said a bunch of times, we need to wrap these elements that show up with each other in columns next to each other. And so header is that element. And so the way we do this, because if we look back again here, these are sitting on top of each other. Foxica is on top of this nav element, but Foxica needs to be over here, and then this nav element needs to be pushed over here somewhere. Okay? So to do that, we take the element that's wrapping around both of them, header, and we say display flex. Now just watch what happens when I save that. Look what's happened. We have our logo, and now it is sitting right beside it. It has created two columns for us. That's awesome. It's a step in the right direction, because if you look over here, you will see that we have two columns over here and over here. But we obviously still have a ways to go for our navigation to look like this. Right now it looks butt ugly. It really does. So we're going to get to that in a second. But now what we want to do is we want to use another property. And by the way, display flex is a property that allows us to structure layouts. There's also display grid, which we will use. But display flex, when you need to create 2 columns or 3 columns or whatever, it's a very good method of doing so. It's called Flexbox. And I could create a whole course on Flexbox alone, but this is a crash course. So we're kind of working through things as we need them. Now, what we want to do is we want to designate this nav element, and we need to push it all the way over here because that's how the design is. We need to use something that will create space between these elements, these Flexbox items. So we'd say justify content, space, between. Save that. And look at that. We have our element right over here. It reaches the very edge of our wrapper element, which has an invisible line that goes all the way around here. All right, great. So next up, another thing we want to do is notice how there's no white space above our logo. And if we look at the design in Figma, you will see we have a bunch of white space. Well, one of the ways we can ensure that white space is there is through margin, padding, and also in our case, and this is another Flexbox sort of property, align items center. So that means all the items that are found within header, which are the A element and the nav element, we're going to align them on, and align items is alignment on the vertical axis. So it's going to align them to the vertical center. So watch what happens. We save that, and guess what? Based on the overall header element that wraps around these two elements, it's going to center them vertically with align items. So this is now centered. We can visualize this actually if we hit F12 to get the developer console. We click on this little thing right here, this little selecty thing. And if we hover over this, you'll see that this is now in the center of this Flexbox container. All right, so hopefully that makes sense. So the developer console, which you can access through F12, is very handy to help you visualize where things are. And there's a lot of things you can do with it. Okay, now we have to work on this nav, because this is default and it looks very ugly. We don't need these little dots and all that crap. Don't need the underlines. So let's get to that. So referring back to the HTML, we have a nav element with a UL element, an unordered list, and then we have our list items inside of it. So what we'll do first is we're going to specify and create a rule set with one property for our nav element itself. And that is going to be a margin of 4M units, or in other words, 40 pixels. So if we save that, it's just going to give us more white space around it. It doesn't make sense as to why I did this yet, but you'll see in a second. And I'll show you a before and after if we remove that rule set we just created. Now, after that, we're going to go ahead and target the UL, the nav UL element. We need to get rid of these little circles because they don't exist in the original design. Again, as a refresher, our nav looks like this. There's no periods, little circles, right? So that's one of the things we'll do in this rule set, among others. So we're going to take our nav UL. So we're chaining these together right here because we want to only target the unordered list that exists within the nav element, because there might be other multiple unordered lists in our design. There isn't, but there could be, so we don't want to just put UL itself. So nav UL just is a command, a selector that says only select in style or apply this rule set and this CSS styling to unordered lists that exist within nav, okay? So, and by the way, we could have given this unordered list a class, like, main nav, and then we could just reference period main nav. So you have options. That's just how I'm choosing to do it here. I wanted to show different ways. All right, and so the way we get rid of those little periods, list style type none. So if we save it, those things will disappear. Ta-da. Now, we don't need 4 rows. 1, 2, 3, 4. We need 4 columns like this. And if you recall, how do we do that? Well, we did it between these elements, the logo and the nav. We simply add display flex. So, display flex, save it. And look at that. They are actually in 4 columns, but there's no white space between them. So that's not good. So how do we figure out the amount of white space to use? Well, we can come over here and we can just Control left click to select this one. And if we hold Alt and then hover over this adjacent nav item, you'll see it says 41. All right, so 4.1. That's why we use that font size 62.5% hack. So we're going to say gap, which is literally gap. The gap between these elements is going to be 4.1 em units. Save it, go back, and there we go. Ta-da. Okay, so now another thing I want to do is, you can't really tell, and we can tell if we get out our dev console, F12, and we select it, and if we hover over our unordered list, so let me zoom up here. Notice that orange stuff around there. You see that orange stuff? Well, that orange stuff simply means that the browser is adding, by default, some styling around this. And if I move over here, yeah, we can see where it says margin block start, margin, it says 1 em unit. And that's essentially what's creating. Also padding inline start. And it's creating white space around there by default that we don't really want. All right, so what we're going to do is reset the margins as it's called. So margin 0. We'll save that. You're not going to notice like a huge difference, but it actually got rid of some white space around here. All right, next up, we have to start actually styling these links, because we don't want these type of underlines. We don't want this color, this kind of purple color. And so what we want to do is, now if we look at the HTML, we have nav ul li a. This is where we start to change the actual appearance of these elements, this A element. So we could say nav A. So this will target any links that are in the nav element. That would work just fine. If you want to be real specific, ULLIA, same thing. Well, it's almost the same thing, except we're being specific. Specificity is a thing. So now what we'll do is we're going to say text decoration none. That will get rid of, if I save it, the underlines. No underlines there now. Also, we're going to say color black. We are going to say text transform uppercase, because these are all uppercase in our design in Figma. And then we're going to go ahead and say font size. Now, what's the font size? Well, Control click, 16, 1.6 rem units. All right, so 1.6 rem units. If I save this, there we go. Now we're a lot closer. I'm going to reset my browser zoom. By the way, you can browse in and out, or zoom in and out with your Control key plus your mouse scroll wheel. All right, so this is 100% right here. Now you might be wondering something, is what is the difference between rem and em? Like, why did I use em on our gap property, but on font size we use rem? Well, in short, typically, most of the time, you're going to use rem units for your font sizes. And when it comes to stuff like scaling, like your distance, like margin and padding and stuff like that, or border radius, you can use ems. And sometimes it's difficult for me to, off the top of my head while coding, explain the difference. Rem simply means root em unit. All right, this is tied to the font size that has been established by our font size 62.5%. The em unit, this gets tricky because, say for instance, this is attached to the nav ul element. Let's say for instance, I'm going to move this over, and we're going to look at the current distance between these elements, these right here. Notice we have this amount of white space. All right, so keep an eye out on that section. If I change over here, let's get this structured a little bit better. So UL is nested inside of nav, and we know that through our HTML. We have nav here, and then UL is inside of it. If I change the font size property to like 3M units or something and save it, look what happened to that amount of white space between these elements. It just like multiplied this 4.1 to some value, right? So if this was a rem unit, guess what? And I save it, it doesn't get affected by the font size that exists in the other elements that it's nested within, if that makes sense. And I'm not going to go into exactly why exactly we'd want to use M versus Rem in certain use cases. There's some great videos specifically about this topic that you can find on YouTube and also articles. But as a general rule of thumb, us CSSers, you're a CSSer now, I typically use for font sizes your rem unit, and then for other stuff, you typically use M unit. Okay. Oh boy, enough of that explanation, right? Okay. So now that we have our list items set up, that's looking pretty good. All right. So now we have an issue, and this is getting more into intermediate CSS, but this is a crash course, and I wanted to show it to you. This right here, this underline. So remember we did text decoration none to get rid of those underlines? Well, it's not like we can restyle those into a version that looks like this. We have to kind of create our own custom little element, this custom little asset underline that we've created. And so we can do that purely with CSS. Here's how we do it. Every HTML element has what's called a before and after pseudo selector. Think of it as just a placeholder value where you can style extra things, like adding an underline adjacent to this home element, this little nav element. So the way we do that is we're going to say nav ULIA, just like above, dot active. Because remember, active is the one right here, home, that we want to add that little underline to. And then what we say is the pseudo element is before. So you put a colon before, okay? Now, when you do this sort of thing, like you're adding extra design accents, we're going to do this as well with the confetti graphic that showed up. When you do this, the parent element up here, we say position relative. And I'm not going to describe what that does right now. I'm going to show you what it does in a second. So we put position relative on the parent, and then the pseudo element, which is attached to it, we're going to say position absolute. All right. Now, just remember, I'm going to explain this in a second. I'd rather show you though. And then what we do is put content empty. It's one of those things that these three elements you're putting together pretty much no matter what. All right. Then what we're going to do is give it a width of like 35%, because if you look at the design, the length of this thing is like 35% of the width of home, essentially. All right. We also have to put, we're just going to do a height of like 1 pixels, and then a border bottom of 2 pixels solid black. All right. So that's how we add a border to the bottom of 2 pixels. We make it a solid because you can do dashed on the lines and stuff like that. We'll save that. And then let's go ahead and see if we see anything yet. Yes, we actually do. Right there. It's above it. We want it to be beneath it. So we say bottom. We could say 0. That looks pretty good, but we want it to be a little bit further. So -6 pixels. All right, just like that. All right, so that was confusing. What happens if I remove position relative? Let's put this off to the side. We'll drag this right here, and I remove this position relative. Well, it disappears. Where'd it go? It's right there, actually, right here. So position relative simply, oops, don't do that, Gary. There we go. Position relative simply means that this position absolute element will be in relative. It'll be based, its position is relative based on this element, its parent element container. if that makes sense. Hopefully that does. All right, so that's how we do that. Okay, now continuing on, that is all the HTML markup that we need, almost, except we do want to have, and let me go back to this and play the Figma prototype. If I zoom up, when we hover over, you can see how the little, I'm not sure if you'll be able to see it well in the video, it's so small. There's little borders underneath it, they're gray, they kind of animate in. We're gonna tackle that at the end when we get to the micro interaction section. So for now, we're good with this section. All right, so let's go back. And what is now the next element we're going to start designing for? It is our hero section. And remember, our hero section has this element called main that wraps around those two columns. So we're going to target those. And by the way, it would be a good idea to get in the habit of adding comments in your CSS. So / we can call this the navbar. And then we uncomment by just reversing. So * first, then /. So then after here, we can do like the hero section. All right, that's looking good. Save that. And now we have, if we refer back to our HTML, we have main right here with two elements inside of it, a left call. Oops, the left call is all the way from here to there, and then the right call. All right, so main, we're going to specify, remember we have a left call and right column that need to be in column format. What do? Display flex. So display flex. That should alter our layout quite a bit. And it did. Notice how the lines, the arrow's smaller, and we have our right call stuff right here in the right column. See how things are starting to come together? It's very exciting. You can make money doing this. It's unbelievable. So we're also going to put a gap or white space between them. If we look at here, we can see this. There's a pretty sizable gap between these elements. It's like the width says 108 pixels or so. So that would be 10.8 rem units or something like that, or m units. So what we can do is say gap, we'll just put 8 m units. And you'll notice it creates white space between them right there. All right, now we're gonna also move it away from this navbar. We need more white space between these elements with margin top, margin hyphen top. And we're gonna give that 11 m units. So 110 pixels essentially. Now it's been pushed down quite a bit. After that, we're also going to go ahead and specify our left call. And we're going to give this a width of 45%. I'm going to save it. All right, so if we look at our design here, this is basically 45% or so of this available space within that main parent container. All right, so that's why I gave that 45%. And another thing to pay attention to is we want this stuff to consume right column, like these 3 pictures. And right now, if we get out our F12 dev console area and we choose this section where it says right call, look how small that is over there. The width, it doesn't extend all the way out. We want that to extend all the way out to this section right here. And we do that with a property, and it's based on Flexbox. This is a flex item because its parent is a Flexbox container. We say flex, oops, sorry, I put in the wrong rule set. We're gonna do right call, because that's the one we're working with now, flex grow 1. If we save that, the design itself isn't gonna change. However, if we hover back over, look how it opened that up. So the default behavior for Flexbox items is it's only going to consume the amount of width it needs based on the content that's inside of it. So that's why initially it was only this big. But we need it to fill out the whole available space, so you use flex grow 1. Hopefully that makes sense. All right, so now we're gonna focus on our H1 element, because that does not look anything like our design. So we're gonna take our H1, font size. Again, how do we do font sizes? Well, we come over here, we select it, we say, it's 52, 5.2 rem. That's what we want. So 5.2 rem units. And again, this is gonna make it big and beefy. There you go, quite a bit bigger, but it's also the wrong font. We're gonna use Playfair Display for the first time. So we say font family, Playfair Display, and then we also say font weight, normal, because it's gonna make it bolder by default. And let's look at this. There we go, looking much better. And also notice, if we click on this, notice that orange stuff. Now, if I zoom up, it's telling us the margin by default is right here. It says 34.84 pixels. And so the margin will be adjusted programmatically by the browser based on the font size. So it's adding a lot of margin around it, and I don't want that margin there, so we reset it to 0. So we say margin 0, save. All right, and now it obviously those orange little indicators went away because there's no margin now. All right, so now let's go ahead and focus on the subheading, which is right here, this tiny text. Again, what is the font size? We click it, it's gonna be 1.8 rem units. So we gave that a class, I believe, of subhead. If we didn't, I'll have to add it. It is, oh no, I didn't add it. So we have to add class subhead for subheading. And then we're gonna specify a font size of 1.8 rem units. Now it's gonna make it quite a bit bigger. There we go. Looking a lot better now. Now we have to worry about this section. This looks nothing like our design over here. Oops, I'm clicking on the wrong thing. There, so we need to translate that into looking exactly like this, essentially. Got our work cut out for us. Okay, so if we refer back to the HTML, we'll see that we have our call to action BTNS, which has two elements inside of it, the browser collection button and the secondary button right here. So you remember, 2 columns means display flex. So we're gonna say our CTA hyphen BTNS is going to be a display flex with a gap of about 20 pixels, so 2 M units. All right, let's save that. All right, there it is. Browser collections right here, and then the secondary is right there. Additionally, now let's focus specifically on browser collection and getting that one working. So now we're going to specify our primary CTA, and that's the class we gave our primary CTA button right here, browser collection. So for primary CTA, we're going to give it that background color. So we're going to say background color. We'll go ahead and grab that color. So we select it. And then we'll see over here, we have this thing called secondary right there. So if we click on that and choose edit style, or instead we can actually go up to inspect tab up on the upper right, and it's going to tell you or show you the CSS property right there. This is the hex code that we want. So we just copy that, we select it and copy, and then we just paste. So we save it, and we're going to see that background color right here. But boy, does that look ugly, right? So we still have some CSS properties to get it looking correct. So we're going to give it a font size because it's 18 pixels, 1.8 rem units. And you know what? It might make sense to move this over here. All right. And then we're also going to get this up just so that you can see this start to take place and shape as we start designing or adding properties. Font weight's going to be bold. All right, here, let's increase this, get rid of that, F12. Sorry, I'm hitting wrong keys over here. There we go. And then we're going to also say color black, text decoration none. Okay, And then we're going to give ourselves some border, a corner radius on the edges. Notice right here, they're just right angles. So we do a border radius of 1.9 em units because it's 19 for the value of the corner radius in Figma. You can see right there. And then we're going to give it a padding of 1 em on the top and bottom and 2 em or 20 pixels on the right and left. Padding is white space working on the inside of a container. So this button, we want to add more padding around. So if I bring this out, we reset this browser zoom to 100%. This is what yours should look like right now. Notice how it's centered, looking good, and pretty much exactly like our Figma prototype. Now this obviously needs work right here. All right, so what we're going to do now is we're going to refactor a couple things. We're going to not necessarily refactor, but we're going to add another selector onto this rule set called secondary CTA because it needs these exact same two properties, a gap of 2 em units and display flex. And the reason we're doing display flex for secondary CTA is because if I show you the code, secondary CTA has two elements that need to be in two columns, the span and this SVG. So going back here, we save that and look at that. They are now into two columns, but we still have work to do because it still doesn't look good at all. So now we're going to target our secondary CTA. All right, and for that, we're going to specify a font size, again, of 1.8 rem units. Might as well just move this over so you can see it while we code. All right, and then also a text decoration of none, color black. And this right here, we're going to put display block because right now it's on 2 lines and we don't want that. Putting display block will ensure that the words don't wrap in this sense. And then we're also going to specify a padding of 1 em on the top and bottom and 0 on the right and left. Now our SVG element, this is too big, we need to fix that. So we say secondary CTA SVG because the element in HTML is called SVG right here. That's how we select it. We could have given a class too, by the way. So width, we're going to say 20 pixels. Now remember I said you very rarely want to use pixels. Well, you can use pixels if you don't care if certain elements have to scale up based on the browser's or a user's zoom preferences for their browser. Some people choose to make their zoom preferences for their browser like real large, but for an icon like this, I'm fine with it staying at a static 20 pixels, no big deal. So for our width or our SVG, that's looking pretty good right there. One other thing I wanted to change or add though is we want to target CTA buttons just by itself in a rule set and say margin 5 em on the top and bottom and 0 on the left and right. That way it pushes itself out a little bit more. Okay, now that's looking real solid right there. Let's see secondary CTA. Let's do align items center. I'm not sure if that changed anything because this looked like it wasn't perfectly vertically aligned. I just want to make sure I didn't screw anything up. Let's see if we remove this, if anything changes. And it doesn't. We can get out our F12, our developer console. And is that being centered? It looks like it is. It just looks like it's off-centered to me for some reason. Anyways, never mind me. Okay, so we are going to make this so that when we hover over this, this will move over This will animate, but again, we're going to wait until after we get everything else done here. Now we have this 50K section to do, which isn't too bad. And we need to make it look like this. All right. So let's extend this out. Underneath there, if you recall, the markup has news and then a paragraph of 50K and a paragraph of details. So we're going to say news, display flex, because remember, we have 2 columns. So now we have 50K. It's hard to see. It's right there, right up against the paragraph. There's no white space between it. All right, so we're going to come back. Oops. Let's get back up our code editor. Gary, you're screwing things up. Okay, there we go. And we're going to say a gap of 3 em units, so 30 pixels between them, a padding of 5 em units, or 50 pixels inside of the news element. So let's see what this looks like. All right, so we're getting closer. We need a border around everything. So we're going to say border 1 pixel solid black. So if we save it, it's going to be just a rectangular border, but we do have a corner radius on that. So going back to our design, we select it. It's going to be 8. All right, so 0.8 will be the actual border radius. Oh yeah, okay, sorry. My reference code was incorrect. All right, so border radius is 0.8 em units. And then we're going to do that trick, position relative, because that confetti graphic that we have to add. All right, so based on our Figma prototype, we have this confetti. So what we want to do is right-click, copy as SVG after you select it. After you have that selected, what we're going to do is oh, by the way, it's already in here, so we don't need to do that. We already saved it as a SVG file, so don't worry about that. Ignore that last step of copying it. So now what we're going to do is we're going to say news pseudo selector before, and we're going to say position absolute, content empty. Remember those 3 elements that go hand in hand. Background is going to be the URL to that image. So we would get out of the CSS folder with the 2 periods / into CSS, and then we select, or into images rather, sorry, and then we choose confetti.svg. All right. We still have to give this an explicit width and height. Otherwise, we won't be able to see it. So we're going to say width 100 pixels or so, height 100 pixels or so. And let's just save it to see if we see anything at this point. Yeah, we do actually, but it's not in the correct area that we want it. So what we have to do is specify a top value. We're going to make it negative. So you can do negative values. It'll be actually above where the news element starts with and you'll see the black line. So for instance, if I save this and show you now, I might as well just show you, not try to describe it. It is starting 20 pixels above it. We also want it to be off to the side by about 20 pixels as well. So left will be negative 20 pixels right here. So we save that, and there we go. Very cool. All right, now just to make sure things are on top of each other, when you use position absolute on an element, you can use what's called z-index, and we can make this like 2. By default, it's at a value where everything's kind of equal with each other. I don't think it really changed anything, but if you need something to show up like on top of something or behind something, you can use negative z-index values and so on and so forth. We'll use it again here at the end as well, and you'll see. Now we have to specify the type, because this is not big enough, the 50K. So that is paragraph employees. Font size is actually 33 in Figma, so 3.3 rem units. Margin 0 to get rid of any default margin. And then we're also going to use a lighter font weight of 200. And there's going to be another element here that I specify, but see, here we are, looking pretty solid right there. Yeah, it actually looks good as is. And then we're going to take our type right here and do something with it. So let's come over here. We're going to say paragraph details. Font size is 1.4 rem, and get rid of any margin. So we're save that. All right, so notice something right here. There's a column established right here, but the 50K is not matching it, right? So this is one of those weird things, and you just kind of understand these things through trial and error. We need to add line height 100% to employees. And now it makes them even along that line. All right, so the bigger your type in is, the more the line height might affect certain things that you don't want to happen. Okay, so now we have this whole left column done. Let me go back to 100%. Looking pretty solid here. Now we have this area. All right, so this is gonna be the first time we use what's called display grid, or the grid itself. Now the grid is an alternative way of structuring a layout compared to Flexbox. We've used nothing but Flex. But if we look at our design, you'll see we have kind of like it's not complex, but it's a design where if you think about things logically, we have, if you think about it like in a grid sense, we have let me get rid of this, add a little stroke, make it red. All right. Think of this as columns and rows. Here's 2 columns with 1 row, and here is another 2 columns with 1 row. So we have 2 columns and 2 rows. Whenever you need to organize things in this fashion, both on the horizontal and vertical axis, the grid is a great way to do so. So it can handle more complex sort of arrangements of layouts. So we have this overall element that wraps around all 3 of these called right call. That's going to be our grid container. All right, so let's go ahead and start focusing on that. So we can put in a comment, right column gallery, and we're going to say right call display grid. Now we can also give it a gap. The physical distance or white space between these elements is 2.3 or 23, so it's going to be 2.3 and M units. All right. Now, if we go back and look, nothing's really changed, by the way. So now, just so we can visualize what's happening, by the way, let's take our card. Each one of those card elements has a card class, and just give it a background of gray, just temporarily so we can see what the heck's happening here. This is what it looks like right now. Unlike Flexbox, when you specify display grid, it doesn't automatically put things into columns. It leaves them as rows like this. That's an important distinction, because if we change this to Flex and saved it, look, it's in columns. So we don't want that though. We want it grid. And then what we want to do is specify grid template columns repeat to auto. So that's the same thing as saying auto, which means they're going to be the same width. If I save this, we see we have this situation. But to save yourself some time, repeat to auto, same thing. We're going to get the same exact result. It's a function. So yes, you have functions in CSS. Now, this isn't consistent with the structure of this, because we want the first card to consume both rows. All right, so how do we do that? Well, we use something called grid template areas. All right, and here's how I do it. Underneath, I'll tab in and I'll put quotes, and we give these names, and you can name them whatever you want. So I want you to visualize this in the context of 2 rows and 2 columns. So left, right. That's the top 2, I guess you could say, grid cells right here. Remember, we created those red lines. So you have one right here and one right here called left and right. Now, Shift Alt down. We're going to keep left there. We're going to keep this the same name, because we want that first card element, which is shown up right here, to span both of those rows. So we keep it the same name. This one, we can just say bottom. So if we look at the amount of words that we have 1, 2, 3 different words, and that we have 3 different cards. And we've structured it so that we give a visual representation that this is the left column, then we have a right and a bottom. Okay, so we're done with that. And now nothing's going to change really from where it was before. Now we have to assign grid area names to each one of these so it knows, which one is going to be called left. All right, so to do that, we simply say card1. And again, that's a class that exists right here on the card1. And we say grid area left. Save it. Look at that. All right, so we don't even have to explicitly name these to over here because it already has the structure that we want. And in that case, you don't even have to put right and bottom. You could just put periods. Look at that. Awesome. So now let's go ahead and start working on our card rule set, because our card rule set, there's a lot to be desired about what this looks like. This looks nothing like this. All right. So card does not need a background because we're going to have image-based backgrounds in a bit. What we want to give it is a border radius. Each one of these has a border radius of what? 8, just like everything else does. Our buttons have 8, so it's going to be 0.8 em units. We also want to give padding of about 16 pixels on the inside around the white little container. I'll just show you real quickly right here. So take this element, Alt. Actually, okay, so this variation is actually a little bit different. I have 11 here. So let's just do 1.1 em units there. All right. We're also going to do a display flex on the card itself. Now, this is a little bit different from what you're used to. We have the div class card element, and we have only a single element inside of it. But we want to make sure that that content right up here is not at the top, but instead at the bottom. Because if you refer back to the design, we'll see that these are at the bottom. So a way to push things around is to make the parent element a Flexbox container. So we say, go back to our CSS, display flex, and we're going to go ahead and say align items end. All right, we'll save that, and now they're at the bottom. So these little tips and tricks you'll pick up along the way. All right, now I actually want to see our images, our photographs, so let's do that real quickly. We're going to say background image, URL, out of CSS folder into images, and we're going to say clothing1.jpg. All right, we're going to save it. There it is. Now, I'm going to take the background size. We're going to make it, and again, card and card1 are applying to the same element here. So we're going to say background size 150%. Save it. And now that changes the size of it. Before it was a lot larger. And we're going to actually, on hover, scale that down to a different size, or scale it up rather, based on hover. But we're going to get to that at the end. So now we need to make this section look like this over here. So let's do that. Oh, and by the way, we might as well, real quickly, go ahead and specify our card 2 and card 1, yeah, card 2 and 3 as well. So we'll say we can get rid of the grid area here, change this to 2, this to 3, this to 2, and this to 3. Save it, and there we go, getting very close. All right. So now what we want to do is let's go ahead and, yeah, like I said, work on those little white containers inside of them. All right, so that's called card details. right here. All right, so card details, background white. Border radius is 1 em unit. Actually, it's going to be more like 0.6 em unit. Sorry about that. And then padding on the inside of that white container with the text. There's 3 pieces of text. There's a title, a little category, and then the price. So that's going to be padding of 2 em units. The width will be 100%. We're going to say display flex. Align items center, so vertically centered inside that white box. We're going to justify the content space between, because we have 2 columns of text, the 2 bits of text on top of each other, and then the price. So it needs to be space between, just like in our nav section with the logo and the navigation. And we'll save that. All right, so that's looking pretty kind of close. Now we have to work and target the actual text to give it proper sizes. So we have a link inside there for the title. So card details A. We're going to say font size 1.4 for rem units, margin 0. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm looking at the wrong rule set on my. Yeah, sorry about that. This is actually going to be color black, text decoration none. Font size for this is actually 16, so 1.6 rem. And font weight will be bold. So this is what that should look like after saving. And then we have the one underneath it, which is just card details paragraph. This is going to be a font size of 1.4 rem, slightly smaller, and a margin of 0. There we go, looking solid. Very close. And then also the size. The font size has to be increased. So P product price is font size 1.8 rem units. Save that. There we go. All right, now if we refer back to the document, there's actually one thing that I 100% forgot to include, which I kind of wanted to include it. Which is okay that I didn't do it. If I go back here to my, in Figma, to my designs, I had an initial design, and it was supposed to look like this. There was supposed to be this graphic right here. I want to show you how to do that, actually. So this file is already an SVG file that's available right here called tag. So I want to get that in here. So the way we do that is we go back to our main, and that exists. It's going to be that technique where we used a pseudo element of before, and it's going to exist on top of card 1 because that's where it's physically located in the design. So what we do is under card 1 we say position relative, and then we use card 1 pseudo element of before, card 1 before. All right, so remember, position absolute. Content is empty. We have a background of URL images tag.svg. And we're also going to put in here no repeat. You can, after doing this rule set, you can experiment with what happens after we remove no repeat. It'll just repeat. It'll look really weird. So we're going to put width 100%. Height 100%. Top is going to be 20 pixels. Left will be negative 30 pixels because it hangs off to the side of the card. And then we're also going to put pointer events. Oops. Pointer events none. All right, so let me show you what that does. Here it is. All right, so if we didn't add pointer events of none, notice how right now I can click on this link, which is what we want to be able to do. If we don't put that there because we specified a width and height of 100%, we won't be able to click this. It will become unusable. So pointer events means they should have no effect on the cursor at all because it's sitting on top of this stuff. So just for your understanding. Now if we remove no repeat, watch what happens. It's all over the place. So we only want it to repeat once, so you put no repeat. Or not, we don't want it to repeat at all. We just want it to be displayed once. All right, that was intense. My face hurts from talking. Ugh. Anyhow, we're not done yet. We need to do those micro interactions. So if I refer back to Figma and we go to the prototype, and by the way, you just click, you select this frame and you click play. And I show you, this is what it looks like. We need to do these little hover animations. We need to do this animation right here where that happens, this little subtle animation, and then this animation as well. We can all do that in CSS. So let's get started. Let's come down here. We'll just do a comment, micro interactions. All right. And the first one that we're going to tackle is going to be the nav hover ones, where the little line grows. So what we say is nav ULLIA hover before. Okay, so we're going to say width 35%. Now, what's that going to do? I don't think it's going to work. Yeah, nothing happens right now if I hover over these. That's because we have to go back up to our nav section where all that stuff is at. All right. And we have to add a couple things. So essentially, what we want to do is have a transition element that's going to be added to our ULAO before a new rule set. So nav ULLIA before. Now notice how before we have our underline, but it's only for the active class, so it only applies to the home link. But these other ones are the ones that we want to hover are the default ones, not the ones that have the active class. So we basically recreate all this stuff right here. I'm just going to copy and paste it back in, but we're going to set the width here to 0. Let's put 0%. Because by default, we don't want to see it, only when we hover. All right, hopefully that makes sense. Now we're also going to make this a gray color. We could grab the color code, but I'm being lazy, from Figma. And then we say, well, for now, we'll just hit save. If we hit save and I zoom up, look, it just shows up. It doesn't grow. How do we make it animate? Well, we say transition width 0.3 seconds. All right, so it's telling us this is going to transition the width property should it change based on something like a hover, and for a duration of 3 seconds, 0.3 seconds rather, 300 milliseconds. So now zoom up, ta-da, they grow. Look how cool that is. Okay, next one is going to be browser collection. This is going to be a very simple one. It's just a simple hover on a button. And so to do that, all we do is come down and we say primary CTA hover background, and I happen to know the color code offhand, so I'm just gonna put that in. Actually, it might not be because it was for my previous project, but we'll see what it does. Oh God, yeah, it's like kind of like a different color that doesn't look good at all. So because I'm a perfectionist, I'm gonna go back, and if I select this and I detach that, I'm going to make it just a little bit darker like that and grab that color code. So that color code is E2D1BD. All right. So I'll back that change up, paste that in. There we go. Much better. Now the Spring 23 collection, we want this arrow to kind of push over, and that'll be a transition as well. So to do that, we're going to say secondary CTA hover, but we want to focus, once it's hovered, we want to change the SVG element, SVG. All right, and then what we say is transform, translate X, which means on the horizontal axis, we're going to push it over by 10 pixels. Hit save. Now zoom up. Now that doesn't transition smoothly because we haven't defined a transition property. So if we go all the way back up and we find a secondary CTA, we're going to transition the transform property by 0.3 seconds. So we zoom up. Oh no, there's something I did wrong, which, you know what, I'm going to leave this in the video because that is going to happen from time to time. So I'm going to simply look over here on my, oh, that's why. I know why. I didn't put it on the right element. It should go right here because we're applying this on the SVG element. So if we save it and I zoom up, it's going to work. Now notice we did have a text decoration of underline on the hover. I'll let you try that yourself. Again, you'll put, all you have to do, actually I'll show you how to do it because you're new, you're not gonna probably figure it out. You might not. Pause, try to figure out yourself if you want. Here's how you do it. Secondary CTA, hover, background, or not background, what am I doing? Text decoration, underline. We save it. There we go. Awesome. And then finally, we have the hover interaction on our cards that we need to do as well. So this time we're going to use a little bit more robust animation system called the animation property with keyframes. All right, so here's how we essentially do that. Oh, actually, we're not going to do keyframes. I'm jumping ahead because there's another thing that we need to do. What we're going to do is say card hover. So when somebody hovers over the entire card, could be anywhere, like the whole background image. We're going to set the background size to 160%. Remember, we set it at 150% for those photographs. Now, if we come back to card, we need to find card. It's right here. Right there. We're going to say transition, background size. Let's do like 800 ms. Milliseconds. We'll see if this works. All right. I did not spell that right. That's why it wasn't working. Now look at that. Very nice. And then we also want this to move up. This element needs to move up slightly to be consistent with our prototype. So to do that, to come back down, we're going to say card. When the card is hovered over, we want to change card details, which is the white container that contains the 3 pieces of type, transform. So whenever you want to move something, you can just transform, translate Y on the Y-axis, and we're going to move it a -20 pixels, which will move it upwards. So if we save it, it's not going to have a smooth transition. To give it that smooth transition, we come back to card details, and we're going to say transition, transform, and again, this could be 800 milliseconds as well. So now they all work as one would expect. Awesome. Okay, so now one final thing. What if we wanted to have a cool animation when somebody first visits the website and things kind of just like grow in or animate. Sometimes you call them page transition animations. Let's do that real quick. Coming back to your HTML, let's add a div class of overlay. And there's not going to be anything inside of it. It's just a div element. We're going to come back to our main CSS, and we're going to specify that overlay element we just created. And let's add a comment here real quick. Intro animation. So for overlay, we're going to say position absolute, because this is going to consume and just kind of lay over on top of everything initially. So what we'll do is z-index 999. It's going to be on the top of no matter what, pretty much anything, unless there's another z-index element that we specify that's larger. Background is going to be white, and the width is going to be 100%, and the height is going to be 100%. So if I save this, we're not going to see our design anymore, because we have this huge overlay element, 100% width and height, background's white, it's on top of everything. We're going to apply a property we haven't used yet called animation. And the animation property accepts a few different parameters or properties. Reveal is one. So reveal is the name. So we can name this whatever we want. The name of your animation. We're later going to define the animation keyframes. So reveal, because we're going to reveal it essentially. The duration of 1 second or 1s. The type of easing, ease in is fine. There's entire videos on this property alone, like ease in and out, cubic Bezier, all this crazy stuff. It's just timing functions for how the animation takes place. And then we're going to say forwards because we don't want it to like reset itself. It's just like it's going to go from this state to the one state, and that's it. Then we're going to go ahead and specify the keyframe animations for reveal. So keyframes reveal. All right. All we say is from transform scale Y1. Let's copy and paste this. Change from to transform scale Y0. Now, if I save this, we're not going to see it initially. We have to refresh. Now, notice how it's animating in. I don't want that. We need to change the transform origin to bottom. So if we do that, refresh, there we go. Now let's make another thing where this whole section in the middle, our left and right column, kind of grows in. So to do that, we're going to take, and remember, what consumes or what wraps around left column, right column, it's main. I'll show you real quick. Right here. So main, we're going to say animation, grow in, camel case here, 2 seconds. Now we're going to use cubic Bezier. I think we're going to use this one right here. These are just advanced timing functions, and Visual Studio Code has a few of them worked in already. We're going to say forwards. We're going to also change the transform property scale to 0.4. So if we save this, we scaled this thing down quite a bit. So now on animation, for our grow in at keyframes, grow in, we're going to say to transform. We're not putting from because we didn't specify the because we were specifying by default already in the selector for main transforms. It's already set at 0.4. So we just put to scale 1. So we're going back to the original scale essentially. So refresh. Look at that. Isn't that snazzy? And we have all of our animations worked in here. Very fun stuff. So this right here is part of the process. Now I say part of the process because we did not make this responsive. So if you visited this website in your phone, it's going to look like a mess. Typically, you want your designs almost like 99 million times out of 100 wait, a 90. Okay, never mind. My brain is fried right now. Typically, you want to make sure that your design works for a smartphone, for tablets, all these different size devices. We didn't make this responsive. All right. So it's important that, if you take this seriously, you want to make sure your designs are responsive and use something called media queries. So this is already a really long video. We're not going to get into that here today. If that's something you want to learn about, if you really think this, HTML, CSS, and obviously JavaScript, we didn't touch on, is something that, you feel that you could really take advantage of and maybe have a career in, or even just as a hobby, definitely consider joining DesignCourse.com, where we do stuff like this and way more in the CSS course, where we make everything responsive, and we have so many different projects and examples where you really start to solidify this stuff as much as possible. So definitely check that out in the YouTube description here at the top. And definitely consider joining. Hopefully you enjoyed that. Make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you all soon. Goodbye.